I was just standing there on my weathered cedar deck, wrestling a stubborn 3-pound largemouth bass off my hook, when I heard the unmistakable, aggressive crunch of gravel coming up my drive. And honestly, I didn't oppose to even have to look up and know exactly who it was, because that specific brand of self-important tire noise could only belong to one person in the entire zip code of Blue Heron Bay. I turned slowly, still holding the flopping fish. And there she was, Meredith Vance, the undisputed, self-appointed Czarina of the Blue Heron Homeowners Association, stepping out of her pristine white SUV like she was disembarking from a royal carriage, while wearing a sun hat the size of a satellite dish and a pair of designer sunglasses that probably cost more than my first truck. She didn't oppose. T say hello. She didn't oppose. T comment on the beautiful morning. She just stood there with her arms crossed over her crisp linen blazer, looking at my rustic cabin like it was a pile of radioactive waste that had somehow contaminated her perfect, manicured vision of paradise. End quote. Mr. Sterling, end quote. She started, her voice sounding like a serrated knife cutting through silk, end quote. We've had 3 complaints this week about your oppos, unauthorized aquatic activities and oppos, and the fact that your dock is currently 2 shades darker than the approved oppos, driftwood gray and oppos, specified in the community bylaws. And quite frankly, the board is tired of your constant disregard for the aesthetic integrity of this subdivision. End quote. I just sighed, letting the fish slip back into the bucket with a wet splash before wiping my fishy palms on my worn-out jeans. And I look her dead in the eye, asking her if she really had nothing better to do on a Tuesday morning than measure the shade of a man's dock, or if the, end quote, aesthetic integrity, end quote, of the neighborhood was truly threatened by a guy catching his own dinner. She didn't oppose. T find that funny. Not even a little bit, because Meredith Vance was a woman who had long ago traded her sense of humor for a clipboard and a thirst for petty power that would make a dictator blush, and she reached in her designer bag to pull out a thick, legal-looking envelope, snapping it toward me with a flick of her wrist. End quote. This is your final notice, Elias, and I suggest you read it carefully, because we've moved past simple fines and into the territory of oppos, community-mandated removal and oppos, which is a polite way of saying we're starting eviction proceedings against you for persistent noncompliance. End quote. I actually felt a genuine laugh bubble up in my chest then, a dry, raspy sound that echoed off the water. And I told her she must have been breathing in too much lawn fertilizer, because nobody evicts a man from a home he bought and paid for in cash 2 years ago, especially not over the color of a dock that's been there since before she was born. But she just gave me this thin, predatory smile, the kind that told me she'd been waiting for this moment, and she told me that when I bought into Blue Heron Bay, I signed the covenants, and those covenants gave the HOA the right to seize and sell any property that became a, end quote, blight, end quote, on the community standards, and as of last night's board vote, my, end quote, rustic charm, end quote, had officially been reclassified as a, end quote, nuisance, end quote. I watched her drive away, her tires kicking up dust that settled on my porch, and I walked inside my cabin, my heart thumping a bit harder than I like to admit, not because I was scared of her, but because the sheer audacity of these people was starting to feel like a physical weight in the air. I went to my study, which is really just a corner of the living room with a big oak desk and a view of the pines, and I pulled out the heavy, leather-bound binder that contained the paperwork from when I bought this place from an old-timer named Silas Thorne. Silas was a man who smelled like tobacco and wood smoke, a guy who'd lived on this lake for 80 years and hated the way the world was changing, and I remembered him sitting right where I was, telling me that this land was, end quote, special, end quote, and that I should keep a close eye on the paperwork because the people moving in didn't and oppos to understand how things worked in the old days. I started flipping through the pages, past the inspection reports and the title insurance, until I reached the original deed, the one handwritten on yellowed parchment that looked like it belonged in a museum, and I began to read the fine print that I'd scanned 100 times but never truly studied with the eyes of a man being threatened with losing his home. What Meredith and her group of, end quote, architectural enforcers, end quote, didn't oppose to realize, mostly because they were too busy counting the height of people's grass to actually step foot in a county records office, is that Silas Thorne's grandfather didn't oppose, just by a lot. He owned the entire peninsula. And when he started, selling, off pieces of it in the 50s to help his neighbors build summer cottages, he didn't end oppos. He actually transferred the underlying title to the land itself. He issued 99-year, non-transferable ground leases that were essentially permanent but legally distinct from fee-simple ownership. When Silas sold me his cabin, the contract was very specific. I wasn't oppos. Just buying a building and a lot. I was purchasing the residual interest and master title to the entire Thorn Tract, which just so happened to be the exact legal footprint of the Blue Heron Bay subdivision. I sat there for a long time, the silence of the woods pressing in on me, realizing that while these people were busy trying to evict me from my porch, they were technically living on my dirt, and every single fine they'd ever sent me was written on a piece of paper that had no more legal authority than a child's drawing in a sandbox. I picked up the phone and called a guy named Marcus, a lawyer I'd played poker with for years who specialized in property law and had a personal vendetta against anyone who wore a tie on Saturday. And when I explained the situation to him, there was this long, terrifying silence on the other end of the line before he let out a low whistle. Elias, he said, his voice dropping an octave, if what you're telling me is true, and that master deed was never officially fractured or subdivided into individual titles, you don and oppos. Just own a cabin. You're the landlord for the entire HOA, and that board she keeps talking about. They're basically a group of squatters with fancy letterhead. We spent the next 48 hours in a fever dream of legal research, digging through digital archives and Dusty County ledgers until we found the smoking gun, a document from 1964 where the Thorn family explicitly rejected a request to incorporate the land into a municipal subdivision, opting instead to keep it as private land trust, The HOA had been formed in the late 90s by a group of developers who assumed the land was standard suburban territory, and in 30 years, nobody had ever bothered to check if the foundation they were building there community was actually theirs to govern. The day of the emergency hearing arrived, and I pulled up to the local courthouse in my mud-caked truck, parking it right between Meredith's Lexus and a shiny Mercedes belonging to a guy named Arthur, who served as the HOA treasurer and looked like he'd never had a hair out of place in his entire life. They were all there, the big three of the board, standing on the courthouse steps like they were about to be inaugurated. And when Meredith saw me, she adjusted her hat and gave me a look of such profound pity that it almost made me feel bad for what was about to happen. We walked into the small, wood-paneled courtroom of Judge Sarah Jenkins, a woman known for having a very low tolerance for nonsense and a very high respect for the letter of the law, and she looked down at us over her spectacles like we were a group of bickering children. Meredith's lawyer, a young guy in a suit that was too tight, stood up and launched into this grand, sweeping speech about, collective responsibility, contractual obligations, showing photos of my, non-compliant, dock of my, overgrown, wildflower garden as if they were evidence of a crime against humanity. He talked for 20 minutes about how the community had voted, how the rules were clear, and how I had, willfully and maliciously, undermined the harmony of Blue Heron Bay. When it was Marcus's turn to speak, he didn't oppose. Stand up right away. He just leaned back in his chair, tapped a thick folder on the table, and looked at the judge with a grin that could only be described as, vampiric, Your Honor, he said, his voice calm and conversational, We aren't an oppos. Here to talk about the color of my client's dock or his flowers. Because, quite frankly, none of that matters when you realize that the Pine Lake Shores Homeowners Association has no more legal right to exist on that property than a lemonade stand in the middle of a highway. The courtroom went dead silent. The kind of silence where you can hear the clock ticking on the wall, and Meredith let out a sharp, indignant, excuse me, but Marcus didn't oppose to even look at her. He walked up to the bench and handed Judge Jenkins the original Thorn Master deed and the 1964 land trust rejection, explaining that the entire subdivision was built on a series of ground leases that had never been converted to individual ownership, and that as the current holder of the master title, my client, Elias Sterling, was effectively the owner of the ground beneath every single home in that neighborhood. Judge Jenkins spent the next 10 minutes reading those documents, her eyebrows climbing higher and higher with every page she flipped, while Meredith and Arthur whispered frantically to their lawyer, who was suddenly looking very pale. Finally, the judge looked up, her expression unreadable, and she asked Meredith's lawyer if he had ever performed a title search on the common areas or the subdivision's foundational land, and the poor kid just stuttered, saying they had, and quote, relied on the developer's disclosures, and quote, from 25 years ago, and quote. Well, and quote, the judge said, her voice dripping with cold irony, and quote, the developer's disclosures appear to be a work of fiction, because this deed is clear. The land belongs to the Thorne estate, which now belongs to Mr. Sterling, and according to these documents, the HOA has been collecting dues, issuing fines, and attempting to govern land they don and oppose. T actually have a legal lease for, end quote. She looked at Meredith, who looked like she was about to faint, and told her that not only was the eviction dismissed with prejudice, but the court was now opening a formal inquiry into the, end quote, unauthorized governance, end quote, of Blue Heron Bay. But we weren't and oppose. T done, not by a long shot, because Marcus had one more rabbit to pull out of his hat, and he stepped forward with a second folder, this one filled with financial records we'd subpoenaed from the HOA's bank the day before. End quote. While we're on the subject of unauthorized governance, Your Honor, we'd like to present an audit of the HOAs and oppos, Emergency Improvement Fund and oppos, which seems to have been used to pay for a series of oppos, site inspections and oppos, that just so happened to take place at a 5-star resort in the Caribbean last winter. End quote. The room exploded then, with people in the gallery, my neighbors who had come to watch me get evicted, starting to murmur and stand up, and Arthur, the treasurer, suddenly decided that he needed to leave the room, though the bailiff politely blocked the door. We showed the court how Meredith and a few select board members have been using the, end quote, fines, end quote, they collected from people like me to fund their personal vacations, labeling them as, end quote, board retreats, end quote, and, end quote, strategic planning sessions, end quote. It turns out the reason they were so desperate to evict me was, and end oppos, T just because of my doc. It was because they had already signed a, end quote, memorandum of understanding, end quote, with a luxury developer to build a high-density condo complex right on the shoreline where my cabin and 2 other older properties stood, and they needed us out so they could, end quote, vacate, end quote, the land and pocket a multi-million-dollar, end quote, consulting fee, end quote, for facilitating the deal. I looked over at my neighbor, a retired schoolteacher named Mrs. Gable, who had been fined $500 last month because her bird feeder was, end quote, too ornate, end quote, and I saw the look of pure, unadulterated fury on her face as she realized these people were trying to sell her backyard out from under her. The judge didn't, end oppos, to even wait for a closing argument. She ordered the immediate freezing of all HOA assets, appointed a third-party receiver to take over the community's management, and referred the board's financial records to the district attorney for a criminal investigation into embezzlement and fraud. As we walked out of that courtroom, the air felt different, lighter somehow, and I stood on the steps as Meredith Vance walked past me, her sun hat drooping and her Lexus Kefab trembling in her hand, and I didn't oppose. T say a word, I just tipped my imaginary hat to her. Within a week, the, end quote, reign of terror, end quote, at Blue Heron Bay was over, and it turned out that once you took away the threat of fines and the fake authority of a board, people actually started talking to each other again. We found out that Arthur had been, end quote, adjusting, end quote, the books for years, and the total amount of missing funds was north of $300,000, which led to a series of indictments that kept the local news busy for months. But the real kicker, the thing that still makes me smile when I'm sitting on my, end quote, non-compliant, end quote, docket sunset, is what happened to the land itself. See, as the owner of the master title, I had the legal right to dissolve the HOA entirely and turn the land into a permanent conservation easement, which is exactly what I did, meaning that no developer, no board, and no, end quote, Zarina, end quote, with a clipboard can ever touch these woods or this shoreline again. I issued new, perpetual deeds to all my neighbors for the sum of $1 each, giving them the actual ownership they thought they'd had for decades, but with one specific clause. No governing body can ever be formed on this land that has the power to tell a man what color his trash can has to be. My neighbor Earl, a guy who's lived here as long as I have, and who once got notice of violation, for having visually distracting, woodpile, came over with a case of beer, and we sat on my porch, watching the fireflies, and he told me that he'd never seen a man win a war without firing a shot quite like that. The community center, which used to be Meredith's headquarters, is now a library and a tool share, and we don and oppos. T have board meetings anymore. We have potlucks where the only thing we debate is who makes the best potato salad. It's funny how people change when they aren't in oppos. T being watched by eyes through the fence, and I've noticed that even the lawns that used to be perfect are looking a bit more wild these days, more like a forest and less like a golf course, and honestly, the birds seem to like it better that way. Sometimes I still see Meredith driving by. She hasn't in oppos. T moved yet, though she doesn't in oppos. T come out of her house much, and I wonder if she ever looks at my dock, which I eventually painted a bright, defiant shade of safety orange just because I could, and I wonder if she realizes that the order she was so obsessed with was just a cage she built for herself. But lately, there's been some talk in the new community council about voluntary contribution for a new playground, and a few of the newer residents are starting to complain that the safety orange dock is devaluing their property, and I'm starting to see that same look in their eyes, that hunger for a little bit of control over their neighbor's life. It makes me realize that maybe the problem wasn't in oppos. Just Meredith. Maybe there's something in the human brain that just can't in oppos. Stand to see someone else living differently, and it makes me wonder if I should have just kept the master title for myself instead of giving it away. So, I've got to ask you, if you found out you held all the cards, would you give the power back to the people who were trying to destroy you? Or would you become the very thing you were fighting against just to make sure the peace stayed permanent? I see both sides of it now, sitting here on my orange dock, and I'm curious to know if you think I did the right thing by letting the neighborhood govern itself, or if I just handed the keys back to a different set of inmates. Drop a comment and let me know, because honestly, I'm still not sure if I'm the hero of this story or just the guy who traded one kind of chaos for another.